That is correct. It is time for another edition of Orange and Blue Today, presented by Sean Ponda, Cecil Lammey, Andrew Mason. Our training camp previews continue, and this time to the tight end position we go, and we have a lot to get to here and a lot of players. I guess I should have asked you off air. We're going to include the fullbacks in this as well, because we got some fullback H-back types too. So, Mace, we're kind of doing it in front of everybody, but we've got quite a few players to talk about here.
Yeah, and I think we do have to touch on them, or probably less so Michael Burton. I think we may have mentioned him in the running backs piece, but there's a rookie in the mix who's got a tight end background, who's also getting look as that fullback H back type. So yeah, we'll get to him, but it's one of the more intriguing position groups on the roster, I'd say.
To be sure, and everyone got all excited and Twitter painted about Greg Dulcich being the Joker. Well, there's more than one Joker, and I'm going to start with Adam Trautman. Dulcich is part of this. Everyone's a part of it, honestly. But with me, it's like, okay, Dulcich, we know what he can do as a receiver. He's very gifted, seems to be working on his physique so that his lower body will stay healthy. But then we've got Trautman there, who Sean Payton clearly loves. Gave up like 4 picks for him with the Saints, and it's taken him some time. And at Dayton, he was a receiving weapon. In the NFL, he's become a blocker. So, yeah, I think interesting names and interesting usage, and what I anticipate will be a lot of 2 tight end sets.
Yeah, it can just take time for some of those guys from lower levels to figure it out. And that's been the case for Adam, but it's interesting of when they brought in Trautman. They, at that point, Sean Payton hadn't really had a look Albert Okwuegbunam. The only guy that he really knew was Chris Manhertz, the blocker who they signed back in free agency in March. And I think, though, what happened in OTAs and minicamp is that Sean Payton started to like what they had in Dulcich and Albert O, but it's all about who's the more complete tight end, and that's what we're really going to get into as training camp goes on. And there's really no denying that physically and as a blocker, Adam Trautman is ahead of Dulcich and Albert O. How much have those two been able to improve? How much can they show that in training camp? I think is going to be crucial, because Sean Payton doesn't want to tip his hand to his play intent with the personnel that he has. And right now, Trautman gives him the most flexibility in that.
Yeah,
regard.
and I'm not against Trautman doing more as a receiver, one, because we already saw it at Dayton, and I'm also not against Greg Dulcich becoming better as a blocker. We haven't had pads on this offseason, so you and I have seen OTAs and minicamp, can't say anything, but like, okay, pads come on, we'll know a little bit more. Dulcich could be better. Okwuegbunam could be better in the roles that they need to be better at, which is, blocking, so it's not a tell.
Yeah, and that's going to be the big thing. The other thing for those guys, depending on where they factor in depth-wise, is going to be a special teams role, which basically for Dulcich and Okwuegbunam is relatively non-existent. I mean, that it came up last year where they didn't have a special teams role, and he was, in terms of where he was in the depth chart, he was at the back end, and that was part of why he didn't get a jersey on a week-to-week basis until Jerry Rosburg came in, worked with him, and figured some things out. One thing that Rosburg did do was establish a template that seems like the Broncos and with Rosburg working with Albert O those last 2 weeks of the 2022 season. It was pretty intensive, pretty focused, very much on the shoulder, kind of trying to boost him up and build confidence in him. And when you heard Sean Payton talk about Okwuegbunam during the practices and minicamp in June, he talked about how plays that Albert O is making out there, and we did see him make some plays during off-season work, which was one of the reasons why I asked Payton directly about him, because that those plays help to build confidence, and that was something that they wanted to do with Albert O, was kind of build his confidence up. And so when I heard that, I thought, okay, Sean Payton's only been around Albert O a few weeks working with him, but he gets it. He gets that you've got to build him a little bit. The talent is there, the 4.5 speed for a tight end. You can't deny that. And I think Sean Payton, the first thing he said when asked about Albert O was he can run. I mean, that's the obvious thing. And that speed is going to allow him to continue getting shots, but you do have to work with him a little bit. This is not somebody who is just made to pull out of the box and play. You've got to you got to put the work in with Albert O. And I do think ultimately the juice can be worth the squeeze, and I think that's one of the things that Sean Payton is finding out why they're putting a bit more into him. But again, it's a question of can they find a role for him, especially if he's a second or third tight end and he ends up not having a special teams job on the. It's the interesting thing. It's part of the overall dynamic of trying to squeeze things out of a 47-man game day active roster.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem, to be sure.
Yeah.
And I believe we also need to kind of explain what the joker position would be out there for everyone, because jokers have included running backs. They're not wide receivers, but running backs and tight ends, and hell, whatever tight end Ty Montgomery was, because he was kind of both as far as like running back and wide receiver. But either way, like there have been
running back
jokers
with a receiver's number.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He's kind of one of the first before the number switch, like they kind of moved
Yeah.
him that way. But either way, like the Joker is going to do a lot, and there's multiple Jokers, and all of these players we're talking about can do that. Trautman can do it. Dulcich can do it. Okwuegbunam can do it as well.
Exactly, and that gives you some flexibility. But what you want is the guy that can do the most right now. Maybe not the best at any one thing, but is the best all around. And that's where Trautman probably still has an edge. But and Greg Dulcich has been working on his body over the offseason. Is it going to hold up a little bit better? Can he be more physical? Can Albert O be in any way physical? These are the things that are going to determine what their roles are going to be. I mean, and while Trautman has, I think, a little bit of an advantage because of his background with Sean Payton, and he does have some upside. They wouldn't have trade for him otherwise. Some untapped upside there that he hasn't been able to reach from his time in New Orleans. It's still pretty wide open here. I'd say all three of those players, when you get out there at training camp, you're probably going to see all three of them making plays with the first team, I would expect. And I don't think we're going to have the answer on this even a couple of days in a training camp. We may not have an answer on it until deep into the preseason. And the answer may well be a 2 or 3 headed monster and giving them all work and then trying to figure out the roster dynamics from there, which is why we talked about in the receivers piece how what happens at tight end is going to impact the construction of the wide receiver complement as well, because it's possible they may choose to go heavy at tight end because of the potential that is there, even though the clock is very much ticking. Both Albert O and Adam Trautman are in the last years of their rookie contracts. I mean, life moves pretty fast, as Ferris Bueller would say. I mean, so they are very much in a fairly urgent juncture of their careers. So it's a key camp, but wouldn't all surprise me if in the end the answer is not choosing one, but choosing all three, and basically trying to kind of come at you in waves a bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are we just staring at tight end by committee? And then are we staring at just game plan wise? Like game plan wise, this is the game where Albert O can attack you better. This is the game where Adam Trautman can attack you better. Dulcich, if Dulcich rounds out his game, there's a lot of talent there if he stays healthy. So it might be a game by game basis. And I always talk about windows, Mace. Like there's a window of production. That might be the first couple of weeks is Trautman. Then the next 4 weeks is Dulcich. Then there's a week of Okwuegbunam. Then it's back to Trautman. Like it's again, good problem to have, but it could have multiple looks this year.
I mean, what if we're talking about tight end being the way Bill Belichick treats his running backs? And you're simply saying, okay, this is based on matchups on a week-to-week basis. And maybe you're looking at a week where you say, okay, we know this team doesn't have the ability at linebacker safety to cope with 2 tight ends who can stretch the field. And we're going to emphasize Albert O and Greg Dulcich this week and say, you figure out how to cover them both. Mixing and matching might be the best play. I mean, the known commodity here, what we do know is that when you're going in heavy packages, you're going to see a lot of Chris Manhertz. Beyond that, I'm not afraid to sit here and say, and I think you'd agree with me on this, that we really don't know what it's going to look like when it gets to week one. There's not a lot of certainty here. There's a lot of potential. We know that. There's a lot of potential. And Adam Trautman, third round pick back in 2020, right? I believe he went in round 3. Yeah.
Yes.
So he went a little bit before Albert O, but a lot of people thought Albert O was going to be a day 2 pick in 2020 as well. So you're also, that's another thing. You're talking about 3 guys who basically went in the same general range of the draft, right? 3rd, early to mid 4th round. So you're talking, that's another layer of intrigue to this, is that you're talking about 3 players who fell to that range for various reasons. And you can say that maybe all of them to this point are incomplete puzzles, that you're just trying to see if the pieces to complete each of them are somewhere in the midst here. It makes it fascinating, but it definitely, I think one thing we can say right now is there's probably not an alpha yet in the tight end room. I think one can emerge, but based on what we saw Albert O doing after in the Joker role, after we saw Greg Dulcich making some plays in the Joker role, and then what we know about Adam Trautman, this thing appears very wide open.
Yeah, wide open. And well, that's why you're watching training camp. If you got your tickets, you're watching training camp for the Denver Broncos. I'm going to bring this up, Mace, and I could be way out of bounds, but it made sense to discuss it with the wide receivers. It makes sense to discuss it with the tight ends, especially because I got word before the draft, like Miami was nosing around Albert Okwuegbunam. They didn't take him. In fact, they picked up another tight end. I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. I could look it up. But anyway, so they filled their role, their need at tight end as a reserve, whatever. Well, if these guys flash in camp, much like we talk about with Cortland Sutton, like if these guys, Albert O's flashing in camp, maybe someone sent him a day 3 pick. Maybe the Broncos bite, because again, you got a log jam of talent here.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. And especially if they look at Albert O. Let's say Albert O, on balance, he's doing some good things, but he is very slightly number 3, or maybe he's like number 2 among him, Trautman, and Dulcich. I'd almost regard Chris Manhertz as kind of another entity entirely who's really not in this competition. Mm-hmm. So let's say among those 3, when you're talking about the Joker role that could also be asked to block and go in line from time to time, let's say Albert O is number 3. But there's another team that would look at him and say, okay, he's going to be our number 2 tight end. That's entirely possible that you come out of it and say, okay, let's make a deal. And it would be for a day 3 pick, because you are talking about a player who, for all the potential, isn't yet proven and is in the last year of his contract. I mean, basically, if you were able to get for Albert O what the Saints got for Adam Trautman, which was basically an exchange of day 3 picks, late round picks, and the difference being Adam Trautman, that's the kind of deal you'd probably take. So, I mean, it may look literally like, if you trade Albert O, it may look like Albert O and a 7 for a 6. That may be what you're talking about. It's a deal that you'd take, but again, keep the expectations low if the Broncos move into deal range, which they may have to do if there's enough of a roster crunch coming with the aforementioned wide receivers.
Yeah, and these tight ends can work the seam. The seam ripper is one of my favorite terms. Like, yeah, you've got some tight ends that can be seam rippers, but you also have big bodies that can be red zone targets. And maybe that's where most of their damage is done. Help move the chains, but you let Jerry Jeudy do the heavy lifting, running back as a receiver out of the backfield. But in the red zone is where Albert O can use that frame. Dulcich can use his ball instincts, and Trautman's very well rounded.
Yeah, and I think also for Greg Dulcich in particular, that's the area where you really want to see him step up. I mean, I think last year, although he was dealing with the hamstring injuries, he was pretty productive for the 10 games that he was out there. The one thing that I wanted to see a little bit more of him in terms of his ability shining through was in the red zone. There weren't many opportunities, but when he had them, he wasn't quite cashing in on them. So that's an area where I think he needs to grow, in addition to growing as a blocker. So basically, compressed field where you don't have as much space to operate, and the blocking game where you're clearly operating in traffic. Those are the things that Greg Dulcich has got to figure out. When Dulcich is in space, that part, that's going to be there. Like, that's going to be there. He's got the ball tracking abilities to be able to make a play, to contort his body, make his play. So how does he do in getting the rest of it? And can he be physical enough? And then the final piece of the puzzle, best ability is availability, staying healthy. So far, so good in OTAs, made it all the way through, no issues, because the hamstring problems did start last year in OTAs. And Greg Dulcich and how he fares health-wise may be the first sign that things are different now than they were before, as the Broncos go through a completely different kind of conditioning regimen with the VP over there, Bo Lowry, who came over from New Orleans, leading the way in that regard.
Yeah, and for me, it's always been about recovery as well. Nothing against the previous staff or anything that happened there, but like you practice football to play football, you respond, and your body recovers because you're stressing your body, and then your body's like, oh, this is what it's like. This is how I have to recover to continue to do that during the rigors of training camp.
Exactly, and we're going to see those rigors come into play, because this is going to be a physical, taxing training camp. This is not going to be training camp 2.0. I do believe that Sean Payton looks at the way training camp was last year, and he alluded to this once earlier in the offseason, and probably thinks, what in blazes was going on here? The every third day being a jog through day, not playing the starters at all in preseason. There are definitely a few teams that do that. The Broncos aren't going to be one of them. But I think I look back on the every third day being a jog through, and I shake my head for two reasons. Number one, you do have to kind of practice football to play football, and risk is part of the game. You accept that. The other thing is, if you wanted to get certain players, certain elder veterans, some rest, you could do that and use those days to give some young players opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise get. And effectively, you were taking those reps away from young guys who were more spry and could handle it, and I think may have had a chance to show something with those opportunities. So I don't like seeing valuable opportunities be lost. We watched that camp. I think I was one who said, okay, let's wait and see. I believe in giving things a shot, and saying, all right, okay, let's see what happens here, and not just simply dismissing it offhand. But now, with the prism of retrospective, we know they messed this up. And I think it's going to look a lot different. I think it's going to be for the benefit of the tight end, especially Greg Dulcich, in terms of getting into a rhythm and not having to kind of stop and start things, hopefully, throughout the summer.
I thought you were going to go Coach Red by you right there, because things are going to get awfully physical.
They will. They will. One guy who's going to be awfully physical, we got to go back and mention him because we alluded to this at the top of the show. Nate Adkins, who is H-back, fullback, tight end, undrafted rookie out of South Carolina. There is a spot for him. If he takes a spot, it would probably be from pure fullback Mike Burton, who came over from Kansas City. I do think for Adkins, it's much more likely we're talking about him being a practice squad player. Burton looks to already be a core special teamer who's going to play extensively over there. It was one of the reasons why the Broncos brought him in, was his special teams ability in addition to his blocking ability. And fullback takes a lot of time to master, especially when you are making a position shift like Nate Adkins is. So with him, I think he's a guy that you're playing the long game with him. You are making him into a versatile player who can do three things and then handle special teams. But it's something I think where it's going to take some time. So the best thing for Nate Adkins might be a year on the practice squad, and then you see where he is the following summer and see if he's grown into a bigger role, because we might be looking at Mike Burton maybe being a guy who's a 1-year player if you can develop Adkins, and then Adkins kind of ends up filling that role next year. We'll see.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think Coach Payton didn't really know what he had at tight end. I mean, they bring in Tommy Hudson. It was a ways into the offseason. But it's like now he kind of fell in love with Dulcich and Okwuegbunam. Doesn't mean they've made it and they're totally set as superstars or whatever, but like he kind of didn't know. They added a bunch of tight ends, and now we're seeing it like chipped away, because fans might ask, like, why aren't you talking about Tommy Hudson? Well, it's jam-packed here, people.
Yeah, and you do need tight ends to fill out practice and make it through when you've got 3 tiers. You got 3 tiers of players. Okay, you can't go out there and say, well, Albert O is going to block with a third team. That's not what they, that's not what they want to do. If they want to test Albert O as a blocker, they're going to get him out there with the ones and maybe against the twos and see what he can do against guys who are going to be playing on Sundays and lining up and doing what they do. So I think that's another factor in there. Tommy Hudson is an insurance policy. If you do have some injuries, he can step in there and provide some depth. But that's pretty much it at that point. And this is and that's okay. When you have players with high level skills, you're going to give them more looks. I mean, Albert O, because of that 4.5 speed, if it doesn't work out for him in Denver this summer, you know what? He's going to get another look, right? If you've got a premium skill set, premium aspect to what you do. In his case, it's being a bigger bodied guy who can run 4.5. You're going to keep getting chances. Just like on the defensive side, DeMarcus Walker is still playing in the NFL. He played really well last year for Tennessee. It didn't work out for him here. Why did he get more chances? He's got a premium skill set on the defensive side because he is interior pass rusher, which are very hard to find. He obviously isn't great defending the run, but because he has one aspect that is coveted in today's game, he's going to get another chance and another chance to find his role. And Albert O, this would not be Albert O's last shot if it doesn't work out for him this summer. But do you want him to get that other chance somewhere else? Or do you say, okay, if another team's going to give him a look, let's see if we can't maximize it here, because tight ends that can run that fast, they don't grow on trees. They're hard to find. They're coveted. And the question is, can you just get that blocking to be willing blocker level? Not effective, but willing. If you can do that, then you have something you can work with, because he's so dangerous when he runs routes down the seam. Like you said,
not to sound like Jeff Foxworthy, but it's a lot of want to. You gotta want to when you're a blocker. It could be that effort blocker. Now, super quick, Mace, as we tie a bow on today's program, and for you and me to be super quick means we got 5 minutes left. Anyway, I have to ask. We're doing tight ends, baby. Like, is there anybody that could be Taysom Hill on this team? When they were entertaining the idea of Sean Clifford, who I cannot believe was drafted by Green Bay. Green Bay's going into the season with Jordan Love and Sean Clifford. But when the Broncos were like, here's Clifford, he's doing the Zoom meeting or whatever, I was like, is that because he's Taysom Hill? Because Clifford can't play, as you can't pass. But he would be that athletic, gadget guy. Is there a gadget guy? It seems like there's not. But again, I'm open to ideas.
Yeah, I don't think there's that guy. There is that type of player here. I mean, for one thing, when we're talking about the Taysom Hill role, let's face it, that's got to be a quarterback. Okay, that's got to be a quarterback who can do other things, but a QB first, right? So you'd look at the guys at that position, and Ben DiNucci, Jarrett Garantano. That's not their skill set at all.
No.
I mean, to be honest, I mean, you look back, and I was disappointed that they weren't looking at other quarterbacks who I thought could have filled that Taysom Hill role better than Clifford. I mean, it was a little bit of a mystery when we first saw that he had the Zoom meeting with the Broncos. Like, okay, I can think of a few players in this year's draft class who might be better. They're better passers than John Clifford, but anyway, it didn't come to pass.
Right.
Pardon the pun. But Green Bay's quarterbacks are Jordan Love, Sean Clifford, and Danny Etling. I mean,
yeah.
I look, they extended Jordan Love. They're basically, if they want to give him 2 years now, they can. But man, you look at that QB room and it's like, are they trying to get Caleb Williams here? Are they really just writing this off here? Are they playing 4D chess? That's what I do wonder is going on up on Lombardi Avenue there in Green Bay. I'm curious.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a Taysom Hill, but I think Sean Payton's okay with that because he's going to craft things to what guys do best. It's awesome. It's great to have the adults in charge at Centura Health Training Center. He is Andrew Mason. I am Cecil Lammey. This is Orange and Blue Today. We're presented by Sean Ponder. Our training camp previews roll on. We appreciate each and every one of you for watching. Stay tuned. And as always, would you please stay frosty? All right. Give me like